Hi everyone, so this is a recording of my presentation that was due to be presented last week, but unfortunately, ironically, I was stuck within the prison and didn't get there on time, so hopefully you'll enjoy watching the recording. So I'm going to be discussing the complexities of researching space and place experience in prison education. Just a little bit about me. I have worked in further education for 15 years, subject specialism of fashion and textiles. I also completed my MA in textiles and MA in education prior to then becoming a teacher educator, which I did for 5 years, teaching trainee teachers to be prepared for working in further education. I then moved over to the prison sector just about 7 months ago now to become a prison education manager, and I am working in a category B all-male prison. It's a local prison. And I'm also undertaking an Ed.D. part-time with the working title of The Effect of Prison Education Space and Place on Teacher Experience, Disentangling a Boundaried Praxis. And I also just want to make the caveat that I am new to carceral geography, so I'm fascinated by it, and hopefully you'll find my work interesting as well. So the spaces and places of prison education are unknown to most, and even for those who work there, the space is transitory and complex. Research of this phenomena is therefore very messy, with multiple ethical considerations. There really is a responsibility demanded to choose sympathetic research approaches, and here I'll share some of the knots I've encountered in designing my research methodology. And just to say that my work is at the intersection of many different subject disciplines, including, of course, prison education, but also social justice, criminology, carceral geography, sociology, philosophy, and so on. Normative approaches to research where I felt more was needed to counteract some of the ethical implications, such as the power imbalances and trust issues that happen within prisons. So I've combined these three approaches, which has offered me almost like an anti-methodology. And it really does help me to resist the familiar and assumed and taken for granted, and therefore opens up understanding and hopefully creates an opportunity to learn more than we would perhaps if I'd used normative approaches. So just to give some idea of where I've got these ideas from, this is my cartography of influence. This leads very much into my literature review, but there are certain influences that I've been inspired by, mostly female, but some males have snuck in as well, including Foucault in there. And these philosophers, artists, some of them, kind of change makers, actually, a lot of them as well, have really led the way with post-qualitative inquiry and post-humanism, and really differing and new approaches to research. It's been a field that's been emerging probably from around 2010, 2012 onwards. And of course there are influences there as well within carceral geography, which are new and have recently been added to my cartography. So I call the approach PQPHFNM, post-qualitative, post-human, feminist new materialism, and within this there are lots of different approaches, and no one size fits all and no right or wrong, and it really is an emerging approach where you have to almost use your gut instinct as to choose what is right to come next. There's a quote here from Cedar, quoted within a work by Bowden. The world is in a constant state of change, and therefore new descriptions are always needed. And I think this is true in the terms of our inquiries as well, that we need new approaches to kind of look at this new map that we're working within. And as I mentioned before, post-qualitative inquiry doesn't mean the dismissal of qualitative inquiry. If anything, it embraces and encompasses a more than qualitative approach. So it's important to emphasise that it allows for flexibility, but it doesn't mean that anything goes. It's still empirical. Mapping queer spaces of praxis is something I'm really interested in, looking at the prison education as the third space within prisons, that place where perhaps power is put to one side. So with that in mind, I've created and designed my research approach looking at walking interviews. My research will be produced by the methods rather than discovered using the methods, if that makes sense. And the initial phase 1 will be using the walking interviews with the prison teacher participants. So I will give them this map and I will ask them to draw where they would like to take me on the walk. And that during that walk we'll also do drawings of material items, non-human items within the prison, which is very much a place that's transitional and obviously boundaried. And this aerial view of the prison was something that really struck me, probably even before I joined the prison. I think this was one of the things when I was doing my research about the prison. I saw this image and thought, wow, how do 1,000 men live here? And yet I didn't even know it existed, and I don't live that far away from it. It's very much hidden from view with the trees surrounding it. So it's, with regards to if we're thinking about the Anthropocene and how the prison takes the land for itself, and yet at the same time that nature is very much useful for me, especially in education, for the mental health and well-being of prisoners. I think there's lots to be unpicked there with the physical space of the prison. And yeah, of course, there are the large walls, the imposing walls, the locked gates. I think it takes me 9 gates to get to my office. The locking and unlocking of those, the intersected pathways. All of this led me to really consider the interaction of this for prisoners and, of course, for the teacher participants as well. And I'm hoping that this sensory and corporeal method of walking really connects the participants to the place and hopefully enables greater communication related to the perception of space as well. So it seemed logical that the interviews were conducted in the space that we're discussing, and that action of walking through the space will encourage their responses, prompted by the environmental situations and perhaps interruptions that we might have. So I'm hoping, I don't know what will happen. I've not yet conducted any of these interviews, but we do have a large bird population at the prison: seagulls, crows, all sorts of weird and wonderful birds come and visit us. And I think that we'll probably get some interruptions from the wildlife. I think we might get as well some interruptions from the prisoners. So we do have to walk past the wings, and prisoners' cells do look out onto that space. And so we might get people shouting through the windows. And I'm really interested in those interruptions. And the gates being an interruption to the walk as well, and how they might create some pause moments during that walking interview. Or will they interrupt and stop that train of thought? So I'm interested in that as well. Where was I? Sorry. So thinking about unlocking people's kind of attitudes and knowledge about the surrounding environment using the walking interviews. I'm really exploring the physical impact of that space on teachers, and their perspective of that. So I know what I think, but I'd really like to know what teacher participants think about that. So I'm taking a post-human perspective, thinking about the place and space, the buildings, the walls, the gates and so on that might have an impact on the teaching and learning experience. And I'm hoping that conducting the interview in situ will create that richer, more effective response, along with the drawings as well. This was a piece of work that I produced myself in the first couple of days that I worked at the prison. I felt like I needed to document my feelings in a piece of textiles work, and was kind of just really exploring this idea of the map. And this led me to coming up with the idea of teachers drawing their route for me before we did the walking interviews. And the knots and the entanglements that occurred, mapping my routes as I was getting used to the prison space, were really interesting to me. And just as a bit of context, within my literature review and reading and writing, right from 2005, recognised the conflict between teachers in a helping profession working within a space that's designed to objectify and punish people. And that's something that I'm really interested in, that real kind of juxtaposition of care and power. And he looked at the culture shock of novice teachers' experiences in prisons, excuse me, and concluded that prison teachers will forever live out their professional lives in a space of liminality within the in-between or borderlands. And that word really struck with me, the borderlands. So as I say, these were my first few days documented within this piece, and mapping my route with these tangled threads. I'm just going to share with you a little bit about a recent paper that I've written that's yet to be published, perhaps because it's not normative and standard publishable work, but it was really almost like a performance piece for me. I needed to work through my methodology, and so in doing so I created a conversation between myself and the three concepts that I'm working with, so post-qualitative, post-humanist and feminist new materialism. And I imagine them as live beings questioning me about my research methodology choices. So for example, here, post-qualitative asks me, do you think you are challenging the normative systems of academia enough? Are you interrupting the patriarchal hegemonic foundations? In the words of Deleuze and Guattari, are you tracing or mapping? These concepts, as their imagined beings, were interrelated, fluid, porous, moving between states and understandings of one another. And like the terms themselves, they're ambiguous characters who share common ideas yet are separate in their identities. And I thought playing with them in this way would help me understand them a little bit more, and it really did work. My response to this question was that there are some threads that are weaving through the methodology, tracing those that have gone before me. So my choice of walking interviews is not necessarily something new, but in a prison, this enables an interaction with the space and all the participants that are both human and non. Taking this approach might not be groundbreaking, but as Aaron Manning suggests, these are minor gestures to move against the system. And the visual and material outcomes of the inquiry are equally as important as the written ones. So I call on my intuition to craft the research, and I'll use my textiles practice to further the creative play in the diffractive analysis of the phenomena, which I mentioned previously. I'm going to be using stitch and weave and macrame and threads to thematically analyse. So there is some more questions here that were posed within that paper. So feminist new materialism asked me, have the restrictions in the prison impacted the choices of your research methods? And my response to that was, yes, of course, there's restriction. And it's partially the feel of that restriction that's led me to explore how this impacts the teacher participants in the prison. The security aspects are an accepted interruption to the teacher's daily classroom practice, but it's not known how this impacts their praxis. Paradoxically, the human rights of the prisoners means that involving them in the research is too complex and time-consuming to gain ethical clearance, and so this has been an influence on the methodology within COVID times. And the second question from posthumanism then is, shouldn't you stay with the trouble and embrace the uncomfortableness? And of course, I'm not comfortable with leaving the prisoners out, but the emphasis of my study is on the experiences of teachers, and to enable the prison voice will take the foci away from the teacher, and the prisoners are definitely recognised as important agents in the research, but not as participants. So there were over 30 questions posed by the concepts in the paper that I wrote, but I'll leave you with this one and the response that I gave it, as it further illustrates some of the knottiness. So posthumanism asks again, what other agents do you think are entangled in your space, time, matter? And for me, it's the prisoners, of course, their convictions, but the locks, the gates, the birds of prey that are held captive in the prison, the birds that fly free overhead, the bees in the prison hives, the absence of technology, conditioning, time, the absence of mothers, childhood memories, teachers as matriarchy, patriarchal order, segregation, COVID, violence, injustice, government policy, privilege, oppression, roots, utterances, prison officers, the words that the teacher participants don't say, and after Deleuze and Guattari. So thank you, and I'll leave you with this quote that after all, the knot is not finished. We expect its boundaries cannot be known. I've shared with you some of my vulnerabilities within this messy research process, and as an early career researcher working in a prison space on the periphery of academia.